This recording was produced by Oregon Trail Baptist Church. If you'd like to get more recordings, or to leave your feedback, please visit us at www.otbchurch.com or write us at P.O. Box 298, Guernsey, Wyoming 82214. We look forward to hearing from you, and we hope that today's recording will not just challenge your thinking, but will transform your life.
All right, Exodus chapter 17 this morning. Exodus 17. A few of these ended up in color, so if you're one of the lucky ones. Yeah, well, and this one ended up with a bad staple, so I'll take that one. If you hit that stapler too hard, it leaves these nasty edges. You want one, Silas? You can follow along or color on it for all I care. Go for it. All right. Exodus chapter 17. Last week we covered the first 7 verses. So this week we will finish out the chapter. I'm in Genesis. I got to get to Exodus. Exodus chapter 17, starting with verse 8. Exodus 17, verse 8. Then came Amalek and fought with Israel in Rephidim. And Moses said unto Joshua, Choose us out men, and go out, fight with Amalek. Tomorrow I will stand on the top of the hill with the rod of God in mine hand. So Joshua did as Moses had said to him, and fought with Amalek. And Moses, Aaron, and Hur went up to the top of the hill. And it came to pass, when Moses held up his hand, that Israel prevailed. And when he let down his hand, Amalek prevailed. But Moses' hands were heavy. And they took a stone and put it under him, and he sat thereon. And Aaron and Hur stayed up his hands, the one on the one side, and the other on the other side. And his hands were steady until the going down of the sun. And Joshua discomfited Amalek and his people with the edge of the sword. And the Lord said unto Moses, Write this for a memorial in a book, and rehearse it in the ears of Joshua. For I will utterly put out the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven. And Moses built an altar, and called the name of it Jehovah Nissi. For he said, Because the Lord hath sworn that the Lord will have war with Amalek from generation to generation. Well, let's pray as we get started here. Lord, we thank you for your word this morning. As we look into this story, one that is fairly familiar, we ask that you'd open our hearts and minds to truth. Speak to us through this story in your word, and we ask this in your Son's name. Amen. By way of review, what have we seen Israel do up to this point after crossing the Red Sea? Okay, good. Now, what were those instances of rebellion? Or distrust, or failure to trust God, or claiming God's murderous for bringing them out to die? Okay, what was the individual events so far? Okay, bitter water. Then what? No food. Then what? No water. Okay, so they've had this time and time again. This story to me is one that we don't really see a negative in it. We don't really see them respond. Did they have to exercise faith here in this event? Yes, they did. And it seems like there's a glimmer of hope because they actually trust God and they see God work. But it's also, this story becomes a little bit of a foretaste of something else to come. And what would this be a taste of that's coming down the line? What are they going to do once they get to Canaan? They're going to conquer the land, right? And so this is a little taste of what's to come. It's almost hard to read this story without reading what Moses wrote about it in Deuteronomy. It's on the bottom of your page here, because there's a few details in what Moses says in Deuteronomy that's not really portrayed here in Exodus. Deuteronomy 25:17 and 19. Moses says, "Remember what Amalek did unto thee by the way, when ye come forth out of Egypt, how he met thee by the way, and smote the hindmost of thee, even all that were feeble behind thee. And when thou wast faint and weary, and he feared not God. Therefore it shall be, when the Lord thy God hath given thee rest from all thine enemies round about, in the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee for an inheritance, to possess it, that thou shalt blot out the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven, thou shalt not forget it." What element does Moses bring up here that we didn't see in Exodus? Okay, right. Now, there's a bit of discussion here because I might as well jump to the second page here. Amalek was descendants of Esau, so there's an element here where they're kissing cousins. They're family of a sort, even though it's hard to imagine that because there's whole clans. But back then you knew your heritage, and it was close, and so they're descendants of Esau. They were a nomadic group, but they were also known for raiding other nations and people. So as they roamed around, they mostly raided other camps and attacked populations to get their wealth. They're also known for using their camels very effectively. I did not know this till reading this, and there's a little discrepancy, but camels can run between 40 and 45 miles an hour on a short spurt. So they can actually outrun a horse. It's hard to imagine, but apparently camels can outrun horses on short distances, but not long distances. So a horse is better overall because you can kind of keep that speed going, whereas a camel will peter out and be done. But what they tended to do was use the camels for a quick in and out, and then recoup later. It could be, we don't know, but what had just happened here at Rephidim? What had Israel just needed, God provided, and other people might want? Water. Okay, so it could be that part of the water is why this is happening. There is a bit of a question. Were they attacking these stragglers behind all the way from the Red Sea and just kind of picking them off? Was this a recent thing that just started happening? We don't know, but it had to be happening enough and consistent enough that Joshua and Moses knew when the next attack would be. Now, it gets into, we don't really know. Did somebody send a warning letter like, hey, surrender or whatever? I don't think that makes the best sense if they've been picking them off from behind. But Joshua here, Moses says, be prepared to fight tomorrow. So there's an anticipation that it's going to happen again, and so we don't really know all those details. However, we know these are descendants of Esau. They're closely kin related to Israelites, and they're known for raiding people. And we know there's water there that they might want. So whatever is happening here, Israel is going to prepare for battle. Now, who's telling them to prepare? Who's telling them to go through with getting ready for war and to fight? God is. He's instructing them and leading them. They know the timing. Joshua's role. This is, as we enter into this character. Several years ago, I did a series on Joshua, so I won't belabor it. But this is the first time Joshua is mentioned in the entire story. What position does he have when he comes into this story? Okay, he's the commander of the army. What's that? Okay, he's also seems to be very closely tied to Moses, like an assistant. Okay, now as Moses is writing this story, and he drops in Joshua, he hasn't introduced him before, but the people probably knew him already. Okay, one of those things is so well known that you don't necessarily write all the details. You know how that works, where everybody knows this, so why write about this or that? So he's introduced to the story. He comes on abruptly. John Durham in his commentary notes, bottom of page 2 here. The abrupt introduction of Joshua in the passage at hand, and in other passages as well, may suggest that Joshua's early training as Moses' assistant was too well known to make necessary details. Rather than that, the Joshua references are secondary, i.e., it's not necessarily the main point of the passage. Joshua's name means Jehovah is help, or Jehovah is our salvation. Does anybody know what New Testament name Joshua gets connected to? Jesus. Yeshua, Joshua. So there's some overlap in the character of Joshua and Jesus, it's more of like might use the term type, where it's a pointing forward to something to come. Not that Joshua was Jesus, or not that he portrayed every element of the life of Jesus, but as he's written about, he's written in such a way that by the New Testament times, they're going to make connections and parallels to draw connections together. He's introduced, in this passage, he's introduced as a servant of Moses. But by the end of the book of Joshua, what is he known as? Okay, leader, but servant of God, right? What's that? Yes, he was. Yes. Joshua and Caleb were one of the spies, the two spies that went and actually reported back well. But there seems a progression here where Joshua goes from being a servant of the Lord, or of Moses, to being a servant of God. When he was a servant of Moses, was he not a servant of God? Of course he was, right? However, he's now listening to God directly himself and following him. Yeah. Yes. Yes. What else, this aspect of servant, anybody know where else this pops up of people claiming I'm a servant of God and the significance of that? It happens a lot. A lot of the prophets write as a servant of the Lord, a servant of this. And I think there's something to consider here, and it's been brought up in a few people, but since we've been going through James as well, James opens his epistle with a servant of the Lord. And often we look at that and see, okay, we see the humility. He's not looking at himself as a apostle. He's not looking at himself as the brother of Jesus. He's not claiming those titles. He's claiming servant. And that element's probably there, but it's such a Jewish book, you almost wonder with this concept of servant, it's the prophets claim that title of servant of the Lord. And it wasn't always necessarily a lowly title, it was actually a high position to be the servant of the Lord and spokesman for the Lord. So there is discussion on the opening of James. Is he meaning humility? Or is he claiming like an Old Testament authority? And I kind of waffle on it. I'm not sure either way, because as you get into James and the tone James carries as a prophet at points, you kind of wonder, is that what he meant there? So anyway, not to bleed James into Sunday school and Sunday school into the book of James, but these are things that people notice in the story, and it's worth stopping and thinking about. Sometimes we don't have answers, but sometimes the pondering and considering is helpful just in itself. Early church leaders were very quick to draw connections between Joshua and Moses. Joshua and Jesus, and then Moses and his relation. Irenaeus, he draws a typological parallel between Joshua, who succeeded Moses, to show the way into the promised land, and Jesus, who supersedes the Mosaic law and leads Christians into their inheritance. So there is some sort of a connection here, and it might just be a literary connection, but Moses was the one who brought them out of Egypt, but who led them into Canaan? And the Mosaic law is what pointed people to the need of a Savior, and who comes on the scene? Jesus. So there seems to be some connections here. Many Christians have pictured the crossing of the Red Sea as salvation and entering into, and I don't think that's the best, or they view the crossing, I got this wrong. They view the crossing of the Jordan as salvation. We get this in some of our hymns, and we get it in like Pilgrim's Progress, where they cross the Jordan River and they enter into heaven, right? I think the better picture, and again, we're dealing with pictures of the Bible in the Bible, not hardcore doctrine. But I think the best picture is as they left Egypt. Egypt in the Bible is often pictured as the place of sin. They come out of Egypt. The crossing of the Red Sea would be salvation at that point. Then there's the wilderness wanderings where, are they God's people? Yes. Are they rebelling and living as they ought? No. They're failing in the wilderness. Then the crossing into Canaan, the crossing of the Jordan River, is maybe best pictured by them learning how to live victoriously, how to live with Christ as the one who fights for them, and coming back to this story in the Bible where they're learning that who's fighting the battle? God is. They're involved, but God's involved. And the true test of the battle is it's up to God, not them. So I kind of look at it as the Jordan River is they're entering into Canaan. You could call that the victorious life. You could call that victorious Christian living, whatever. Did they win every battle in Canaan? No. Which tells me it's not the best picture of heaven. There's still struggles in Canaan. There's still strongholds. But compared to the wilderness, Canaan was characterized by victory rather than defeat. And in the wilderness, we have more of a characterization of defeat and surprise by victory. So looking at kind of some big picture Bible picture, I guess, or types. Joshua is given the task here in this passage of choosing men to fight. Now let's think about this. They've left Egypt. They've probably been out of Egypt for about 3 months. Do you think slaves had great military training in Egypt? If you had slaves, would you teach them to fight? I mean, now I guess maybe if you had them as mercenaries or whatever, and I guess that might work in weird sections of history, but they're not. These aren't soldiers. They've been slaves. They've been impoverished. So I think here the choosing of men to fight, he's just trying to find some guys who actually can wield a weapon. We don't have any record, or there's discussion, but when they left Egypt, we don't know that they took weapons with them. Slaves don't generally have weapons. So the challenge is for Joshua's here probably finding men who could fight rather than like the challenge Gideon faced where he's paring down how many men. He's just trying to find enough to muster an army here. And he's given 1 day to do it. So, hurrah, let's find 1 day, get all the men together who can fight in a day, and go from here. Now he was supposed to then pick the men, lead them into battle. That's very much the human side of things. Okay, not that Joshua was wrong or doing anything, or Moses was wrong. His side was very down-to-earth, practical, human. What is Moses' role in this conflict? Yes, and standard bearer is a very good term for it because he sits on a hill. What does he take with him to this hill? The rod or the staff. And we talked about how that was a symbol of God's power and authority. It was a symbol of life and regeneration. And so there's a little bit of confusion here because notice with me, if you would, early on in this text, let's see here, fought with Israel. Verse 11. And it came to pass when Moses held up his hand. Okay, so how many is he holding up here? 1. Okay, that Israel prevailed. And when he let down his hand, Amalek prevailed. So here we get the image of he's holding it in one hand. But then in verse 12, but Moses' hands, plural, were heavy. And they took a stone and stayed it on him. And the end of verse 12, and his hands were steady until the going down of the sun. So this has led to much speculation. Did he start with one hand and switch to the other and switch back and forth until both were tired? I'm not sure that point is relevant. Okay, what's happening overall? The rod of God had been used by God through Moses for the Red Sea, the plagues. This has happened time and time again. And so this rod has been used in Exodus 20, where he lifted up the rod, smote the waters. It was used in Exodus 14, where he stretched out his rod over the Red Sea. So it's a symbol of God's power and authority. And any person fighting in the battle that day, to look over and see this rod reminded them of what? Or God's power. And not just his power, but his presence. He's with his people. Remember the last story? That was the thing. Is God really with us? So there's an element here as they see Moses standing there. Now, on a human level, a critical commentator would say they were just inspired by the fact that, and I think, no, it wasn't just they fought better because they were inspired, but it was a symbol of God's presence. The discussion also gets into how he's holding his hands. Holding them up like this, or holding the rod up for Moses, was a signal or a sign of dependence. Douglas Stewart notes in his commentary, it was important that the Israelites understood unmistakably that the only reason they could win against Amalek was that God was fighting for them, giving them the victory. If you've ever heard this passage preached, what is probably the first application that comes to your mind from things you've heard from this passage? Does anybody remember any sermons from it? I'm not here to critique any other pastors or anything like that. It's often preached as a passage encouraging us to pray. Now, in putting his hands up, it's a sign of dependence on the Lord. You ever throw up your hands? I quit. I'm done. I'm depending on someone else. Okay? So there's an element here of that may be the posture, but plus with the rod, the fact that, hey, this is your battle to fight, Lord. This is your people. This is your battle to fight. And so he lifts up his hand. He holds it up. They do well. The battle begins, verses 10 to 11. Joshua did, as Moses said, he begins to fight with Amalek. Moses and Aaron and Hur go up to the hill. So here Moses' hands become connected to the battle itself. I have a note here again from Douglas Stewart. He says, in the ancient world, the posture of prayer was with hands held up to heaven, as such as, and then he lists off several passages. Ancient pictures of prayerful supplication do not generally suggest that the hands were held above the head or over the shoulders, but rather in front of the chest or face, pointing upward in what today we might think of as a typical posture of prayer, with hands clasped or hands kissing the mouth. Moses was not simply praying, however. He was serving as the representative of Yahweh, whose presence was manifested symbolically by the staff. Now, Moses' hands get heavy. You ever tried to hold your hand out for a long time? Okay, and we've seen it done with like kids in school who think they're all strong, and it's like, okay, now hold your hands out, and then the teacher like lets them stand there or whatever for who knows how long, and they start to no, keep them up. What doesn't seem heavy over time is very difficult, and so Moses' hands begin to drop, they begin to fade. Aaron and Hur are there to help, which brings in another question: who is Hur? And now I don't mean her as in a female pronoun; I mean her as in H-U-R. Who's this person? The simplest answer is we don't know. But we can tell from this story, him being close to Moses and to Aaron at this point, he had to be an elder or leader in Israel of some sort. We don't know the names of all the people. We don't have a census report. We don't have any of that. It seems that Hur was the son of... one speculation here is that Hur was the son of Caleb, and I guess I shouldn't say speculation. He was the son of Caleb and the grandfather of the famous artisan Bezalel, who worked on the temple. He's mentioned along with Aaron as assistants to Moses. Now, the question that then becomes, is this Hur the same Hur that is standing on the hill? We're not sure. Josephus, early church historian, he identifies him as the husband of Miriam. Can we trust Josephus? Who knows? He could have been both, all right? However, the point is he was somebody who comes alongside Moses. He had to be of a high ranking within Israel's structure. And how did Aaron and Hur assist Moses here? Okay, so before they held up the staff, they got something for him to sit on. So he's still somewhat propped up to be seen, and they helped him hold up his arms. And I am fascinated. Commentators literally get into discussing how they were holding the rod in his hand. I'm like, guys, have you just lost it here? I mean, they're holding this up. The point of this whole thing is this rod has become the symbol of God's presence. Israel is now depending on God for the battle, and they're putting it on display for all the people to see and to be a reminder to them, God is at work. He's fighting for us. Okay? You don't need to know how they locked each other's arms to hold the staff, all right? This is just... Anyway. Overall, Joshua wins the battle. He wins the day. In verse 13, he discomforts the people. And this is a foretaste, as I said before, of victory in the Promised Land, where there's a partnership between God and his people. And I use the term partnership deliberately. Could they have won the battle if they didn't go on the field? Now, God could have made it so they won, but following God's directions, they were to prepare to go to fight. Could they have won the battle on the field had Moses, Aaron, and Hur not done their part? There is and this is important because in having faith and trust in the Lord, it does not mean we're passive and we do nothing. Our faith must be active. And sometimes our active faith will look passive to others. Don't get me wrong. And we don't want to put God in a box where the phrase, I do my half, God does his half. Okay, well, that's not exactly how it works. But in dependence on God, when I'm following God and I'm doing what God has for me, I'm not resting on my ability. Joshua and the men shouldn't have been resting on the fact that they were such good swordsmen. All right? They're resting on the fact that God is with them. So the point of this passage, although prayer is often tied to it, the point is God is with his people. And yes, we access God through prayer. Yes, we are exercising our dependence on God through prayer. But I think the deeper, stronger point is God's presence among his people. And as you go about your life and your daily struggles and what you face, are you depending on God's presence working itself out in your life, or are you depending on your ability to do what God has called you to do? I think of it in this way. There's two types of flesh. There's the flesh that gets talked about in the New Testament where it's all bad. Whatsoever is not of faith is sin, and the flesh profits nothing. And we think of fleshly activities as sinful things we do. But there's also a type of flesh that is good flesh. It's a flesh that desires to do what God wants, but do it in my way. So, or for my benefit. For instance, A.W. Tozer writes about this. I've used this illustration probably too many times, but it's stuck in my mind. In fact, it's so much stuck in my mind, I remember listening to it on a tractor back in Minnesota. So that's where I heard him use it. But he said, as Christians, we're not always so vain as to want to be on Time magazine. But we'll go to the altar, we'll get on our knees, we'll pray that God would send revival, he'd work in our church, he'd work in our community. We pour ourselves out to God, and in the back of our minds we're thinking, maybe they'll put my picture on Christianity Today, or this Christian magazine. It's like, we wouldn't be so vain as to think Time or Newsweek or some of the big ones in a secular world. And that pride thwarts us before we get started. And sometimes even good things we do, we can try to do God's work our way, and we'll find it fails. And the good flesh, the good things we do without depending on the Lord, it really stinks in the nostrils of God. It's like having a good hamburger or steak that sat out all week. It's no longer a good hamburger or steak. It still may be a hamburger or steak, but it ain't any good. So I'll read here what one commentator notes. He says, the two actions, therefore, are important. It is as important that Joshua fights with the sword as that Moses should wrestle in prayer. Neither would be effective without the other. The battle does not ultimately depend ultimately on Joshua's skill as a swordsman, but neither is it one apart from Joshua's engagement. Similarly, Moses' prayer is nothing without the practical service of Joshua, who remains dependent on Moses' intercession even though he cannot see him or hear him beyond the din of the battle. And John Durham notes, he says, everything about the encounter takes second place to its primary point, Yahweh's intervention for Israel. And that is the point this dictates from the form this section takes. So the point here is God is working on behalf of his people. Are they going to... Here they're actually stepping up to the plate. They're doing what they ought to do. God's doing his thing. We have victory. We have a dynamic victory here. The underdog is winning. Another interesting note about this passage is verse 14. And Moses said I'm getting tongue-tied today. And the Lord said unto Moses, write this for a memorial in a book, and rehearse it in the ears of Joshua, for I will utterly put out the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven. There are 5 times in the Pentateuch, or the first 5 books of the Bible, where Moses is instructed to write something down. Probably what we have here is a snippet or a reminder from whatever Moses wrote down that day. It got right incorporated into Scripture. But that gives us a few clues about how the Pentateuch was written. Had Moses wrote, at this point, any of the first 5 books of the Bible? Probably not. Okay? Most of that probably happened when they were at Sinai. However, was he taking notes of what was happening? Was he putting some things together? And so a short pencil is better than a long memory, right? So he's writing some of this down, and he comes back to it. He may incorporate exactly what he wrote down. He may work the story to send theological messages, but he's writing this stuff down. That's actually a very important key, because a lot of critical scholars say they passed this on by word of mouth time and time again, and these stories got passed on and developed and grew and changed. That is true of the Middle Ages. It is not true of biblical literature. And it seems odd because in the Middle Ages, that's later than the biblical times. So why the change? And the change comes from ancient people did really well to preserve their histories in writing. Okay, not everybody could read or write, but they had a whole class of scribes to do that. In the Middle Ages, when masses of humanity were unable to read or write, how did they communicate? Sitting around a campfire telling stories. And so scholars looked at the Middle Ages and then they applied that to the past, and it's like, no, we got better info than that. Kathy, you had something? Sorry. Yeah.
Do you think this is part of what Josiah had read when he said when he rolls out?
I think so. It had to be the first 5 books. It had to be, from his response, he had to read at least the section after Sinai, because he was looking at the instructions of what God told them to do, and none of these instructions were really given yet for a king. So he may have been reading, late Exodus, early Numbers. He could have been Deuteronomy. He could have read the whole thing. There is a bit of some technical issues on Mosaic authorship, and that's Moses wrote the first 5 books. I fall in the camp. I don't have a problem with some of them during the King's period that have updated some things. And by update, this is what I mean. Like, we watched the video on patterns of evidence. Pithom and Ramses, the city of Ramses, before that was known as what? Does anybody know? Avaris. Okay? So there were some names that got changed. It wasn't a tampering with the text. It was as all history does. Places change over time. The names change, and so there was an updating that happened. And when was that done? I'd say if God's hand could start it, and God's hand worked through Moses, I don't see why God's hand couldn't, when someone said, hey, nobody knows what this place is anymore, let's put this name in instead. I don't see that as tampering. That's a whole other issue of inspiration But I have no problem saying Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Old Testament, not New Testament. But there's certain points in there that there are some sticky wickets, and so critics will point at the sticky wickets and say Moses wrote nothing, and it's like, wait a minute, guys, you've just extrapolated from like one little point to that he wrote absolutely none of this, and like a text like this tells us he's writing things down along the way. We don't know how many things he wrote along the way, but the way the story of Exodus has been told so far, it's not just history. And I think that's important to understand as we read. When we read Exodus, we're not just reading the history of Israel, we're reading theological messaging. So what I mean by that is it's written in such a way it sends a theological message of who God is, who the gods of Egypt were, how they were powerless, how God had power over them. It's written to show, because there's a few issues of chronology. We covered in Exodus 16 with the manna. What did they do with the manna? They put it in the what? Ark of the Covenant. Time out. When was the ark made? The ark hasn't been made yet. Okay? So there's elements to these stories that make us take a step back and go, okay, Moses is writing after putting this in and telling us, okay, this is what happens with this moving forward, even though the ark wasn't made yet in chapter 16. So you have to take a careful approach, because you either have people on one side who just try to take everything that doesn't seem to make sense to them and point at it as flaws, and it's not flaws, it's just how else would you write this down and explain this? And if you have a message to get across, how would you get it across without that? On the other side, you have people who make up all these crazy hypotheses of how the ark happened before, and it's like, stop. They're writing, they're telling their story just because it may not be as accurate as a scientific forensic examination. But here's another valid point. If I asked you what you did yesterday, and you told me the story of what you did yesterday, and then I asked you for proof, I could probably tear down all of your proof just like critical scholars tear down this text. You can't prove even today, and even say, well, I got video footage. Oh yeah? Did someone doctor it? You know what I'm saying? And was the date on the camera correct? Or, there's even, so when we try to hold the Bible to a standard that we can't even hold ourselves to, there's something wrong. And we have to take a step back and say, God is communicating through His Word. The message of the story of Exodus, is it historical? Yes, it happened. Is everything in it, is it theological? Yes, they're writing a theological message for us. And where points don't align, often you'll find there's some significant reasons why. And sometimes, since we're so far removed, it's hard for us to see some of those. So I hope I've, in all the discussion here, put confidence in you in the text, and yet an understanding to go, okay, when people say this stuff, there is some things there to be discussed, not generally what you get preached on. So comments, questions there? Because, yeah.
We have to remember the Bible as we have it in this format is not chronological.
Right.
So even the chronological Bibles, they go in and they fill in details,
Mm-hmm.
as in the manna and the barn.
Yeah.
You kind of go back when the story develops, and you go, and this is what happened. You kind of bring it around.
Right.
So that you can understand. So it's not like they're editing the Bible or the fact. They're just filling in the details at a point in time where you'll understand.
Right. Yeah. And we see some of that gets really interesting in the crossover between Old and New Testament. Because we see stuff from the Old Testament coming into the New, and then we also see stuff from the time between the Testaments coming in. So, Will. Yes. Yes.
So what we say is not chronological. We have nothing to do with how they thought and how they communicated.
Yes. Very, very much so. I'm just not as versed here in the Old Testament. I remember preaching on a passage in Luke, and as I was preparing to preach, one of the big discussions on that passage was, why does Luke have this out of place with everybody else? And the problem, we look at that as moderns and we say, Luke got his chronology wrong. And we look at him as a mistake. And even the commentators seem to miss some of this. The big picture is, Luke is actually, I think what's happening there is, and this comes from some journal articles and stuff I read, but Luke follows Isaiah 53. It's like he laid Isaiah 53 out, and as he wrote his Gospel of Jesus, he's writing it through that lens of Isaiah 53. And this story of what happens with Jesus fits better at this point than later. So, is that a mistake? Is that an error? No, it's a literary technique. Did the story happen? Yes. But even like when the different gospel writers write, what did Jesus say after this event? And it sounds a little different here and a little different there. Why isn't it all the same? Look, if you told me about a conversation you had yesterday or last week or 3 or 20 years ago, do you think you'd say it with the exact same words every time? But would we get the message of the conversation? And so sometimes Jesus' responses in the Gospels, we see how they match better the big theme of that Gospel and how the writer is writing through their Gospel. And so are they wrong? Are they different Jesuses? No, they're not. It's the same Jesus they're pointing at from different angles. Yes, it points the chronology doesn't fit their message they're trying to send, so they'll move things around. And they felt free to do that. And in fact, they found in scholarship now that, oh, yeah, it was normal when Greeks wrote biographies to completely rearrange chronology to fit a narrative or story. So for them to do the same thing in the Gospels, that's not abnormal. It's a type of writing. So anyway, this was all written for the purpose of a memorial to be remembered. Amalek would only exist in the memory of Israel. Does anybody know when Amalek was pretty well wiped out? Did it happen under Joshua? No. It happened under Saul. Wipes him out one time, but then there's still some more of them. David finishes it off, and then there's still a couple times there. During the time of David is when they were pretty well wiped out. However, there's a neat literary connect to Amalek in a later book of the Old Testament. Anybody know what later book has a connection to these people? Book of Esther. Haman was a Agagite. Now, that's not Amalek, but who is the king of Amalek at the time of David, or at Saul? Agag. So here's another point of lots of discussion, but the biggest thing I see is a literary connection pitting the descendants of the Amalekites versus descendants of Israel. Was Haman actually a descendant from Agag, King Agag? Who knows? I mean, the Mishnah, have any of you seen, they do some Bible movies of books of the Bible. There was one done on Esther, and King Agag gets his wife pregnant before they, not just in the movie, this is actually Jewish midrash. He gets his wife pregnant before Samuel comes to kill him, and she gets away, thus has a son, and they have a whole, the line continues. That's how the Jews try to fit these stories together. We don't have to fit them together to know that what's happening in the book of Esther is helping us mimic what's happened long ago. In fact, it gives us in Esther, Mordecai and Esther were connected to the tribe of Benjamin. Saul was connected to the tribe of Benjamin. So, there's things like that happening in the Bible and literature, connections that it's just hard to pin down some of them. So I guess we'll stop there for now, and we'll close out in prayer here. And yeah. Lord, we thank you for your word, and Lord, we just ask that you would help us to lean and trust on your presence here in our lives now. We ask that you bless our service to all your sons. Amen.